So we're switching gears again. Remember how we're doing this class? We're kind of painting the history of the millennium, one layer at a time. We first gave the basic skeleton at the beginning of the last week. I just the bones, so to speak, of the class by giving the valid entities that can enter as character, as agents, as historical agents in our explanations. Then we cover that with a couple of, to get a little bit of skin with a couple of layers of economics. The last two classes we've added the next two layers of biological aspects. By now, hopefully, most of you are beginning to realize the importance of considering material flows in the history of humanity, even if we've been just concentrating on a small part of humanity and a relatively small period of time. We have now by now seen how important a variety of material flows, from fossil fuels to food, to flows of genes through generations, to flows through contagion of diseases are. So the question now is, can we speak of cultural materials non-metaphorically? Is it possible to think of songs, of paintings, of cooking styles, of dressing styles, and most importantly of all, local urban dialects as cultural materials without metaphor? I gave you a hint last night when I said that all languages begin as oral languages. Writing comes much later. Writing comes with urban life. Writing comes with centralized government, just like hierarchical money comes with centralized government. So does writing. And writing did not begin as a means of communication, some way, a way of writing letters, or even a way of writing laws. It began as a means for logistics, a way of keeping track of materials and so on, in the construction of pyramids, in the construction of large monuments, keeping track of who's paying tax and who's not. So language is primarily oral. And as such, as I mentioned at the end of last class, it is basically acoustic matter in the most literal sense of the term. Just like an instrument needs some way of producing a pulse of air rich of harmonics, and then a resonant chamber that amplifies some of those harmonics and enriches the sound and gives a certain timbre and so on. So our vocal apparatus is like a musical instrument. We have larynx and vocal cords that produce pulses of air very rich in harmonics. It's not just any pulses of air, pulses of air that are sculptable into vowels, for instance, or into consonants. And then with our tongue, by placing in different positions in our mouth is, of course, the resonant cavity, but it's not like the resonant cavity of a guitar that is fixed in form. It's a resonant cavity that can change in form by positioning your tongue in different places. That's for vowels. For different consonants, we also need to include lips and teeth, because many other consonants, like B, are teeth, demand some action with your teeth and your lips. Either way, you're shaping pulses of air, and those pulses of air inhabit the air around us and can be registered by your ears as sounds of a particular language. Or sounds, language is not just pulses of air, it's pulses of air arranged in a particular sequence, forming words. And then words arranged in a particular sequence, forming sentences, and sentences forming paragraphs. So in that sense, we still have the part-to-whole relationship that we have been using throughout the class. Sounds, or letters in the case of written language, are the component parts of words. Words are the component parts of sentences. Sentences are the component parts of paragraphs. And words have emergent properties that sounds do not have, such as semantic content, the meaning of a word, Sentences have properties that words don't have, such as the ability to state a fact about a certain situation. Words cannot state facts, so it's very rare to find a single word. You can find them, particularly in certain languages, where sentences have been reduced to single words, and by now uttering the single word, you utter the full sentence. But in general, you want to state a fact, you need to use a sentence. And therefore, that capacity belongs to the sentence, not to the word. It's an emergent property of a sentence. And similarly for arguments made out of many sentences, in which the logical conclusion drawn from a premises is now a property of the entire argument, we're still talking about here about assemblages. Bottom of it all are made out of shaped pulses of air, are made out of acoustic matter. As I said last class, when writing goes up here together with urban life, things become even more material. Particularly in the case of writing like Babylonian writing, which are carvings on stone. I mean, those pulses of air now haven't been mineralized. But even if we're talking about ink on papyrus, or we're talking about a digitally shaped pulses of electricity going through them cables or radio signals as in the internet, we're still talking about a material substratum for language. And yes, we're not saying that language can be reduced to matter because of all the layers of emergence that it has. Emergence, if you remember from the very first two classes, is blocks reductionism. It's one of the most important parts. To say that communities have emergent properties, that organizations have emergent properties, that governments have emergent properties, that industrial networks have emergent properties, that one is to say we cannot reduce everything down to human beings, to their rational decisions, to their phenomenological experiences, because there are many entities with properties that are simply not present in human beings. From the other classes, we also need another thought in order to get this class started. The importance of the distribution of variation in a population. I've been saying all along that every single entity we talked about in class is an individual entity. Not an individual person, of course, but a unique historical entity with a date of birth and a date of death. That makes it an individual in an expanded sense. Individual communities, individual organizations, individual governments, individual cities. Unique entities that cannot be reproduced, just like you yourself cannot be cloned. Someone can take your DNA, create a clone, but the embryological history of that clone, the socialization history of that clone in a family and in school and with friends and so on will be entirely different. It may look exactly like you, and it will have exact same genes, but it is not the same person. You are unique, unreproducible. So are cities, so are communities, so are organizations, so are nation states, so are every single entity we've talked about in class. And yet, singular and unique does not mean solo, does not mean one entity. Our singular entities, our individual entities always come in bunches, populations, multiplicities, pluralities. And what we want to know about those populations is how is the inevitable variation from one individual to the next, inevitable because each one is unique. And so therefore each one is going to have identifying traits that are unique to it. How is the variation distributed? Does it, for instance, completely random? So that there is variation, but there's no one shape that fits the overall distribution of variation. Or, if we apply statistical thinking, can we discover a statistical distribution, a normal distribution, a long-tail distribution that captures the distribution of variation? Finally, last class we talked about evolution. And we thought, and we saw an even more specific way in which variation is linked to populations. Without variation, a population of replicators cannot evolve. And it cannot evolve because the filter, the sorting device, whether it's selection pressures or the pressures of a selective breeder, doesn't have anything to filter, doesn't have anything to favor or disfavor. If the entire population is homogeneous, they are identical with exact same properties and exact same genes, well then what can the filter do? It lets everybody pass, or it lets nobody pass. But if there is variation, then the filter can, say the filter being natural selection, predators, parasites, climate, it can favor those who better meet the fight or the struggle against predators, parasites, and climate, and let those reproduce more, while let others reproduce less. Now the filter is doing something. It's letting some variance in, it's not allowing some variance in. But if you stop that variation, if for whatever reason the gene pool of the species becomes homogenized, evolution stops at that very moment. So that's an even more, it's an even more specific use of the terms population and variation, because it's now applying to replicators. Not every population is a population of replicators, but in every population, the distribution of variation matters. So we are continuing here right now ideas that we've been gathering throughout the semester, throughout the class. So the last thing I mentioned yesterday, that despite the fact that genes are the first replicators that were discovered in this planet, and perhaps the first replicators that existed in this planet, there are other replicators. Patterns of behavior that are transmitted by imitation, that we called memes last night, a term by Richard Dawkins, a zoologist who has published many interesting books, and norms, patterns of behavior that are transmitted through social obligation. It is very important to keep that distinction in mind, not to make all of human culture a matter of memes, because that is the way, that's what you're going to find in the web when you start Googling the word meme or Googling the word memetics. You're going to find people who are now misusing the term, overgeneralizing it, applying it to everything. Everything is just a meme. Ideas inside your head are memes. Cultural patterns are memes. Technological innovations are memes. And they do not stick to the definition that a meme means to be a pattern of behavior that is transmitted by imitation. When technical words begin having its definition mangled, they stop being technical words. They become goofy, silly words that people use just to pretend they know what they're talking about. Here we need to stick to the technical definition that we give of words. So I said that some patterns of behavior, those patterns associated with fashion, for instance, are transmitted by imitation. And if we consider that firms, economic firms in particular, copy or tend to steal one another's secrets and copy, or if we consider import substitution dynamics, the process from, theorized by Jane Jacobs that we talked about the other day, in which creating cheap knockoffs of foreign imports is a way to get started an economy, get started in relation skills in your city. Well, those cheap copies are imitations of the products, and we can say that those products have been transmitted as memes. But that's it. The moment a pattern of behavior is obligatory in a given culture, in a given community, in a given organization, in a given country, it stops being a meme and becomes something else. It has normative power. It's obligatory. It's compulsory. So let's call the replicators that make up language norms. And as I said last class, there's at least 3 layers of norms because of the different emergent properties. Sounds, the sounds of English, or the phonemes of English, or the phonemes of any language, are one layer of replicators. They are transmitted from one generation to the next. Words of English, and the syntactical patterns of English. At the very least, we have 3 separate layers of replicators transmitting themselves from one generation to the next. The question now is, can we explain the history of dialects in this millennium, the history of European dialects in the previous millennium, simply by thinking about the distribution of variation? So that if variation is kept under control, then we are predicting that that language is not going to evolve into many different languages. If variation, on the other hand, goes out of control for whatever reason, then that language should keep give rise to many languages. So that's what we're going to explore in the class today. Is the distribution of variation throughout the millennium such that whenever variation increases, the number of dialects increase, and vice versa? Whenever variation decreases, the number of languages decrease. Let's explore that thesis. But first of all, let's talk about the mechanism of replication. If we're going to be insisting that norms are not means, that we're talking about a different type of replicator here, well, then we have to give a mechanism of replication. And if the replication is via enforced obligation, then we have to give a mechanism of enforcement. And in fact, we've already talked about that mechanism of enforcement. It's communities, tightly knit communities. Remember what I said about communities? When in a tightly knit community, inhabiting a small town or inhabiting an ethnic neighborhood in some large city, everybody knows everybody else. Word of mouth about local violations of norms, or violations of local norms rather, spreads very rapidly. A broken promise, an unpaid debt, an unreciprocated favor, anything that is at the dishonoring of a commitment to your community or to a certain person in your community, everybody knows about it. And therefore, that community can act as a way of, the community as a whole acts as a way of, as a memory of the reputations of its members. And then via ridicule and ostracism, laughing behind your back, refusing to interact with you, it can then punish you. So the next time you keep your promises, so the next time you pay your debts, so the next time you reciprocate your favors, and so on and so forth. Well, that same mechanism is used today by a special type of linguist called sociolinguists. I'm going to give you the name in a second. To account for why, for instance, dialects in England or in Britain still survive despite the fact that the dialect of London became dominant a long time ago, and despite the fact that the BBC, the voice of London, broadcasts that language throughout the island, and therefore there are no geographical barriers that can stop that language from entering your house, despite the fact that tourism, which became much more prevalent when prices for railroad tickets became cheaper at the turn of the century, brings tourists from London, tourists from cities near London to other parts, and therefore you get to hear all this other, you get to hear the standard language. Why is it then that those communities keep their dialects to this day? Let me give you an example. Just a silly example, but just to make the point. Imagine that you live in a very small town, far away from London, but in England, and you speak some weird dialect with some weird, quirky little words, and perhaps a few sounds that are different, perhaps a few syntactical patterns that are not those of the standard, and in such a way that someone who comes from London can tell immediately, boy, that person is not from London. And you send your kid to study at a university in London, Oxford, for instance. 4 years later, you're in a pub in your community, drinking with your buddies and being part of the community, and your boy comes in the bar and asks for, hey, hi Dad, I want to ask for a drink, and he asks for a drink with his new fancy London accent, right? Which I cannot even simulate right now, but if need be, we would have somebody to articulate that for us. Now, what do you think the rest of the people in the pub are going to say about your kid? A, wow, what a fancy accent your kid has. I have to send my daughter to that university. Or B, what an asshole. Who does he think he is? How dare he come into the bar and speak with his fancy London accent? Get back to London, you fool. A or B? I'm sure most of you would agree that the answer is B, ladies and gentlemen. What an asshole. And the reason is that a dialect or a language, in addition to being a means of communication, is a badge of local identity. Speaking the dialect of the place, speaking your mother tongue, your dialect, the dialect of the town you were born in, It's part of what makes you part of that community. Every bit as much, if not more, than keeping your promises, paying your debts, reciprocating your favors. Even more so because the breaking of a promise, or reciprocation of a favor, is an event that occurs isolated. It can be punished. But somebody coming with his fancy accent and pretending that he doesn't care, well, that person doesn't belong to the community anymore. He or she is making it clear he doesn't care about belonging to the community. So what do actual people do? After all, they have a dilemma. They've already learned the standard, and now they have to switch back to what their original mother tongue, their mother dialect. Well, they do what sociolinguists call switching codes. It's a practice that everybody that's multilingual engages in. You switch to your local code when you're back in your community, when you talk to your friends, when you talk to your family. And then you switch back to the standard when you go to a job interview, when you go report something to the police, when you have to speak to the judge, or whenever you are with a stranger who may categorize you as a hick because of your accent. You may or may not think that your accent is hickish, but if you are with some really, some person that would immediately categorize you by your accent, well, you switch codes to your fancy London accent. And you get to be good at it. Switching codes is a practice that everybody engages in. Now, these kinds of ideas come from a branch of linguistics. I love this as an introduction, called sociolinguistics. Of which the most important representative, the founder, as a matter of fact, is William Landa. Not exactly not a household name, but he should be. He should be every bit of a household name as Saussure is for French, or as Chomsky is for English. Chomsky and Saussure being, of course, the two superstars in the linguistics firmament, each one for those two languages. Except that unlike Saussure and Chomsky, Labov thought populationally. Labov thought probabilistically. Labov thought like we are thinking in this class. He's always looking for how the variation is distributed. Whereas Chomsky and Saussure assume that language has homogeneity that it does not have. Standard languages, official French standard, official English standard do have a certain homogeneity. We're gonna talk about how that homogeneity was achieved historically. But if you're and of course, standard English and standard French is the kind of English taught in English universities and American universities, and standard French is the French used in French universities. So if you're a university professor, you speak an artificially homogeneous standard, and you may not even notice that you're speaking an artificially homogeneous standard. So if you use yourself as an informant, that is, if you don't go out there on the streets to find out what people are speaking and what they're saying, well, then you're going to be misled into thinking that language is more uniform than it in fact is. Let's take, for instance, the example of Chomsky. Chomsky is famous, and rightly so, for having stressed the difference between syntax and semantics. Having said, sentences have emergent properties that words don't have, because grammatical patterns are different than semantic information, the meaning of words in a dictionary. And in order to do that, he invented a sentence which became famous, which is completely nonsense in terms of semantics, but that every speaker of English can recognize as a sentence of English. The sentence is, "Colorless green ideas sleep furiously." Now, what the hell could that possibly mean? Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Now, if ideas had any color, which they don't, they could not possibly be green and colorless at the same time, and if they slept, they probably would not sleep furiously, and that every speaker of English can tell that colorless green ideas sleep furiously is different than sleep, colorless, green ideas. I mean, just the same words in a completely different order. There's a subject, there is a verb, and then there is a predicate, which is what you're saying about the subject. And when you say colorless green ideas, sleep furiously, colorless green ideas is the subject, sleep is the verb, and furiously is what you're saying, is an adverb that applies to that verb. Syntax has an independence from semantics. The semantics can be completely missing, in the sense that being completely nonsense, and yet the syntax, the syntactical emergent pattern of a valid sentence of English is already there. But do you think that Chomsky went out on the street and asked people, well, do you think that colorless green ideas live furiously is correct? Do you think that it is? Do you think that it is? No. He asked himself. He probably never even left his office, right? Why would I want to have to go out there and ask people when I know, because I'm a speaker of English, that this sounds correct? And maybe for that particular case that was good enough. But for other problems, for instance, to measure the degree of variation there is in a particular dialect, or whether there are several dialects of the same language being spoken at the same time, you need to go out there. And the first one who went out there, is the first one in the 20th century, is William Landa. William Landa is famous for having been the first linguist to use a tape recorder. Literally, a tape recorder, not a cassette recorder, one of those big tape recorders. And nevertheless, he took around to capture this acoustic materiality that we're talking about, and then brought it back home to study the variation. He staged a variety of experiments, the most famous of which was one in which he decided to see whether the language spoken in New York, the English spoken in New York, has variations that arrange themselves in layers following social classes. In other words, he wanted to know whether the rich speak a different type of English, slightly different than the middle classes, and whether the middle classes spoke a different English than the lower classes. So he took 3 department stores. I believe at the time the lower class store was Woolworth's, the middle class store was Macy's, and the upper class store was Saks Fifth Avenue. The choices don't really matter. The fact is that he just went in with a tape recorder and recorded. Rich people asking him stuff, and the salesman answering them in a dialect or in a variation of New York English that sounded rich to the rich people. Then he went to Macy's and recorded the same exchanges between 2 middle class clerks and customers, and then he went to Woolworth and did the same thing. He came back to his office, and after doing analysis of the tapes, he realized that there were in fact variations. Not extreme variations, so that we could say that the rich spoke a different language. There were variations of English, but the kind of variations that you would not possibly detect it unless you have a tape recorder, unless you capture material, linguistic materials, record them, and then do a statistical analysis of the population of sounds. Then you went and sampled the population of sounds. Then you come back with a sample and analyze it statistically, and you discover, yes, there is variation in it, and the variation follows class lines. I'm going to mention the name of Lavov several times throughout the class because he is very important. So, we're going to be using sociolinguistics, therefore, to talk about not structural linguistics or any other kind of linguistics to talk about in class today. It is because we need, of course, a theory that includes variation as a crucial concept, because that's what we're going to be doing for the rest of the class. Tracking how the variation has affected linguistic history. So, as you can see from our little diagrams, I'm drawing it again. The diagram of urbanization, the upswing between the year 1000 and the year 1300 and so on. I'm adding 500 years earlier here because I want to say that with the fall of the Roman Empire, something happened to Latin. All the vulgar forms of Latin began to diverge. And then there are other periods which I'm going to be referring to as we go along. Let me begin at the beginning. Before 500 AD, that is before the fall of the Roman Empire, everybody in the areas that had been Latinized by the Romans, and of course cities to which the Romans had built roads and to which they could send troops, and where the cities occupied and run by Roman officials and so on. For as long as the empire was in possession of its land and running the empire on a day-to-day basis, everybody in the Latinized areas thought they were speaking the exact same language. And they, in a way, were. They were all speaking Latin. And the inevitable variation, it was a very large portion of land occupied by people who had had all their languages or other languages earlier that were not Latin. There was going to be an inevitable variation, but the variation was kept in check. It was kept in check by the presence of Roman officials, by the desire of those people to feel that they were part of the empire, by the fact that those people could speak to the Roman soldiers, they could speak to the Roman officials, they could speak to priests who spoke in Latin. And so for as long as the empire was intact, variation existed, but was centripetal, in the sense that no one was aware that there was any divergence, no one was aware there was any variation, because the variation was contained. Latin was a single language at the time, with some variants. But the moment the Roman Empire fell, we're talking about replicators that replicate through enforced obligation. So the moment you remove the enforced, at least the enforced from organizations and state institutions, the only other enforcement comes from your local community. And your local community is only going to enforce whatever it is being spoken in your local community. So vulgar Latin began to diverge. Variation began to accumulate that was not anymore centripetal, but centrifugal. It was variation that was pointing outwards. So, in the period that we're talking about right now, right, prior to the year 1000, there were in fact two different types of Latin. Written Latin, say by the year 800, let's say, the year 800 is Charlemagne's reign. It is the first attempt by a king of France, or by a king of what would become France, to put back the Roman Empire together. It failed, but nevertheless, he made an effort. And there was a series of reforms that he made, political, economical, linguistic, that he made, in order to try to guarantee that that would be the case. So let's take that as our point of reference, the year 800. But the year 800, the empire has been there for 300 years. So written Latin is the only thing that preserves well, because writing lasts longer than oral language, right? Nobody really knew how those words were pronounced back then, but they knew how they were written, because you could have books by Cicero or books by any famous Roman jurist or Roman doctor or Roman philosopher, and you could check whether this word belongs or doesn't belong to Latin. And it was, of course, the Latin of the upper classes. Written Latin was prestigious, was spoken by aristocrats, was spoken by the ecclesiastical authorities, was the language of prestige and the upper classes. Nevertheless, because it was all referred to texts which kept the variation in check, written Latin was mostly homogeneous. And that is, it did not have variation in it. And if you don't have variation in it, then you are sterile. You cannot give birth to new languages. Highly prestigious, but sterile. Now, some people, that's the way they like their languages. Vulgar Latin, which is in fact many types of Latin, since they were being diverged all over, away from Rome, was humble. It was oral. It did not have a written tradition. But nevertheless, it began to be infused with more and more variation as the years went by, and gave rise to a multiplicity of dialects. Several forms of Spanish, or more exactly, several forms of Hispano-Romance, not only Castilian, which is the Spanish that lasts to this day and is the dominant form of Spanish to this day, but Catalan, which is still spoken in Barcelona, Leonese, Aragonese, which are perhaps not even spoken anymore. Several forms of French, not only the French that we know today, which is the French of Paris, Francien, as we now call it, but also Provençal, spoken in the south of France, Norman French, spoken in the north of France, and a whole other variations of Franco-Romance. At the time, they were not called French, of course. Finally, even in Italy, every city had its own dialect. There was Tuscan, the Italian or the Italo-Romance of Florence. There was the dialect of Milan. There was the dialect of Venice. There was the dialect of Sicily. Different forms of Italo-Romance. So that is what happened between the year 500 and 1000. An explosion in the number of new languages, and yet without anybody noticing that it had happened. And the reason why is this. And we're moving on to the situation of the year 1000. In the year 1000, what had happened is that hundreds of dialects, literally, had emerged, but there was sufficient overlap between them that they formed what is called a dialect continuum. You could literally go from, say, let's assume that this was the French spoken in Paris to the Italian spoken in Florence. And if you moved slow enough and spent a few days on every village and every time that you crossed, you might not even realize that you had actually gone to a completely different language. The transition would be so smooth and there would be sufficient overlaps that you might not, unless you were a linguist, realize you'll notice that there are differences, but you still think everybody's still speaking Latin. Sort of like the situation today with Arabic. Arabic has all kinds of variants today in different countries, and yet most people, when you ask them what language are you speaking, they will say, I'm speaking classic Arabic, the language of the Quran. They would be insulted if you told them, look, I'm sorry, but that's not Arabic the way it is in Saudi Arabia. Nevertheless, and that was exactly the situation back then. You needed an expert. You needed a William Labov. You needed somebody who went out on the street and checked what exactly had happened, checked the state of the variation. So in the year 800, Charlemagne began a series of reforms, particularly 809 AD, for language, as for many other things. One of the things that he needed to do was to create, since the only thing that survived from the empire was written Latin text, he needed to create rules of pronunciation that were standard, particularly when the Bible was read out loud during Mass or in other occasions. You could not allow variation in the way that written Latin, prestigious Latin, was read. So he had to hire a grammarian to do that. You can reconstruct a few things from the old Romans, say, by looking at poems and seeing what words rhyme with what other words. So at least now you know this syllable was the same as this syllable. And therefore you can if you're a professional, can reconstruct, but a lot of it was also invented. The empire had been down for 300 years. No one lasts 300 years. And therefore there were no living speakers of the original Latin. So it had to be reconstructed. Alcuin, by the way, is the name of the grammarian, the professional grammarian. He hired a very old 9th century Labov, because Alcuin, in addition to devising those rules of pronunciation, he went out on the streets. He went out on the streets to check out, well, what language is everybody else speaking? Are they still speaking Latin? And he came back to Charlemagne after doing a careful study. He didn't have a tape recorder, but he had a very keen ear. And he said to Charlemagne, Your Honor, Your Majesty, I don't know what the hell they're talking out there, but it is not Latin. It is what we call today all French. And he called it Rustica Romana. Kind of a rustic romance. And that is the first name for a language, for a dialect, that began the process of becoming aware that we are not speaking Latin anymore. Over here we're speaking some form of Spanish. Over here we're speaking some form of French. Over here we're speaking some form of Italian. No one was aware of that until a queen went out on the street and checked out for variation. And so, clearly, this was a very important moment. So now what we want to know is what happened to all those dialects that were born out of vulgar Latin and were given birth by the population of replicators, variable replicators, once this upswing started. Now, before I say that, what I just said counts as evidence, at least for the time being, that for as long as there is central control of the variation, a language stays more or less the same. The moment those authorities fall, like the fall of the Roman Empire during a war, and now there's no enforcement anymore, there's no guards that you have to go tell, there are no judges that you have to switch codes to, the variation becomes centrifugal, and things begin to diverge. Because that is what happened exactly in those 100 years. So this is the situation in the year 1000 AD. But now, the upswing in urbanization, which we began to create regional capitals, as well as transforming little rural villages into small towns and small towns into medium-sized towns, and particularly the intensification in commercial life that implied, began to put pressures on language. People still thought they were all talking Latin, despite Alcuin. Queen's findings were not popular findings, and not everybody knew about Rustica Romana. There were no names for languages at the time in the year 1000. No, you would never be able to go to a place. What language are you speaking? We're speaking French. What language are you speaking? We're speaking Castilian. But soon, that awareness began. And it began when cities began hiring their own grammarians to create spelling systems or writing systems for their now mostly oral languages. Precisely because the written form of Latin did not fit their languages anymore. So now they needed a new form. But the impulse for that was an explosion produced by the commercial revolution of the 11th century in the uses of writing. All kinds of new documents began to be in high demand. Licenses. You were a merchant in a little bazaar, in a little marketplace. You need a license to put your stall in, or you need a license to practice to enter a particular guild, or you need a license to sell things or to engage in maritime commerce. So you need to be a written document that you presented to some official. Petitions to the king. You're a community that has been oppressed, or has been unfairly judged, and you make a petition to the king to right that wrong. Well, that petition had to be in writing. Denunciations. You're again a community, or you're a person who's having fights with a neighbor, or you're a store owner who's having fights with your neighbor, and you need to denunciate that to the police or to the authorities. Well, that needs to be a document, that needs to be well written. Wills. You know, you're going to die, you need to leave things to your kids. Post-mortem inventories. You didn't get to write your will, so now your kids are, dividing up your stuff. Commercial contracts of all sorts. Insurance contracts for long shipping voyages. All of a sudden, writing documents in itself became an industry. Italy, or Italian cities at the time, by the 11th century, had become a notarial center. You know what a notary public is. A notary public today is not exactly a very elevated figure. They work mostly in drugstores, but you need them every time you're going to send a document to the government, and there needs to be a witness with a license to practice that witnessing that sees you sign the document, and then they put a little seal on the thing. Last time I had to go to a notary public, the guy was working in a drugstore, so he wasn't exactly, like a lawyer with fancy offices or anything. Nevertheless, notary publics, people who can validate, write a document and then validate it and witness that you're signing the document, were already around by the 11th century, and Italy had become a notarial center, meaning people from out of town would come to Italy to get documents produced. The moment the Italian cities, Florence, Milan, Rome, Venice, Genoa, each one began hiring grammarians to produce a writing system, a spelling system for their own dialect. The moment the Spanish cities, León, Aragon, Madrid did not exist yet, but the region that Madrid would become a capital of, Castilla, did exist. Barcelona began to hire grammarians to develop spelling system for the dialects. And the same thing for the French. The Parisians hired somebody to write, not only to do documents, but to do more sacred type of writing. For instance, translating the Bible into your own vernacular. Translating the Bible into your own local dialect. That was a sacred mission, and there were races between cities to see who translated the Bible first. For all of that, you needed a spelling system, and the spelling systems have to be invented. Whose language is oral. And at that point, written Latin, was a dead language. People spoke it, but only in the upper classes, and it wasn't exactly the language of merchants, the language of commerce, the language of government. So, the moment all of those regional cities had their own spelling system and could write documents in their own different dialects, now you could compare a contract written in Venice with a contract written in Paris, with a contract written in Barcelona, or a contract written in León, and go, well, that's not the same language at all. We all thought in the year 1000 we were still speaking Latin. Well, think again, because we're not speaking Latin anymore. And little by little, thanks to those documents and the circulation of those documents, people started to become aware that Latin had diverged into a multiplicity of languages, of which there were still not clear winners. The language of Paris still competed with the dialect of Paris, still competed with the dialect of Lyon, for instance, for supremacy and cultural hegemony. Certain languages began to get more prestige than others. This had to do with a variety of factors. For instance, if writers of literature picked a particular dialect of Italian, or a particular dialect of French, or a particular dialect of Spanish, and began writing in that dialect, by the time there's 2 or 3 writers writing in that dialect, all other writers wanted to write in that dialect. That happened to Tuscan, the dialect of Florence, when Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarca began writing their works of art in that dialect. From then on, Tuscan became the Italian dialect for literature. And of course, its prestige moved up. Prestige acts as a selection pressure. Prestige, in this case, acts as a filter. It begins giving the replicators that have more prestige a much higher power to propagate. And the replicators with low prestige have only the capacity to maintain their own base, that is, their own communities. They cannot be transported away from their communities. So accumulations of prestige, which follow the prestige of regional capitals and the prestige of different types of cities, began to select certain languages from others, began to favor certain replicators from others. In addition to literature, warfare could contribute to accumulations of prestige. This is what happened to Castilian, the dialect which happens to be the one that won, and the one that I speak as my mother tongue. Castilian in the year 1000 was in fact inferior in prestige to Leonese and Aragonese. But because a large chunk of Spain had been occupied by Muslims, by Moors, for at the time 5 centuries or so, and there was a war of reconquest. That is, the Spanish began pushing the Moors out. That war was fought, of course, by a whole variety of cities, armies from a whole variety of cities with different dialects, but as it happens, for very contingent reasons, speakers of Castilians happened to win some of the most famous battles. happened to win, for instance, the battles in which they took back Toledo, which is a very famous city, Granada, which is another very famous city, Córdoba, another very famous city. And not only were they giving prestige to their language by being the winners, they moved troops and they moved population from their own region into these other reconquered regions. And by moving people to the other regions, well, they propagated their replicators to the point where, a couple of centuries later, Castilian was now the superior form of Spanish and began to push aside the others. Some of them disappeared, Leonese and Aragonese. I'm not totally sure to what extent they have completely disappeared, to what extent they are still kept in a few enclaves. Others resisted, like Catalan. Catalan has resisted in many different ways. In our own century, or the previous century, Generalissimo Franco tried to make it illegal. Well, not try to make it illegal, made it illegal. And yet Catalan survived. Today you go to Barcelona and street signs, store signs, and so on are in Catalan, not in Castilian. There was active resistance by the people, by the speakers living in that city and living in, of course, in the region of Catalonia that city was the capital of, that resisted that linguistic takeover. So, this upswing then, it corresponds to the rise of the vernaculars. Okay? The vernacular simply means a lower level dialect, but that has now become an important language with a written version. All the other dialects that did not get to have a written system because their cities did not have the money to hire a grammarian to do that are today referred to as patois. I believe that's the way you pronounce that French word. Which basically is a put-down word. You would never really use it as a, oh wow, you speak a patois. It's like, ooh. Speak a patois is a dialect without a writing system, therefore inferior. And so distinctions began now to emerge between the vernaculars, but this period from 1000 to 1500 is called the rise of the vernaculars because now the specific dialect of French spoken in Paris, the specific dialect of Spanish spoken in Madrid, the specific dialect of Italian spoken in Florence began to compete with written Latin. In a variety of functions. So much that by the 1400s, both in England and in France, laws, which up to that point were obligatory to be written in old, prestigious written Latin, began to be written in their vernaculars. That is, in the English of London or in the French of Paris. Before I move on, let's talk about that other part, that other branch of Indo-European, which is also very important for our history here. English. English belongs to a very different branch of Indo-European than Latin. Latin and Greek belong to one branch, and draw that again. That curve, by the way, is part of a diagram. Don't take it too literally. Outside of the power of the Roman Empire were, of course, German tribes of different types, who were never conquered by the Romans, and who eventually were the ones that brought down the Roman Empire. Pushed, perhaps, by nomads from the steppes, the Huns and others. We're going to be talking about the nomads of the steppes when we discuss warfare on Saturday morning. So, among those Germanic tribes, and as soon as the Roman Empire was born, were Angles, Saxons, each one with their own dialect, Jews, coming from an area roughly in the southern part of Denmark, or what today is Denmark, but in a Germanic area in that corner of and the moment the Roman Empire falls, a few decades later, they invade England and colonize it. Let's blow this up. see what the situation was. They were, of course, original inhabitants of England, the Celts, who had already been Christianized and had their own language. They are pushed to one side, and the new occupiers move in masse and create another dialect continuum. And a similar process begins to happen as what happened here. One of the cities had a more prestigious dialect, developed spelling systems called West Saxon. So West Saxon, I think we call it West Saxon anyway. I'm not sure it was called that at the time. And a very famous piece. Is that the way you say Beowulf? A very famous piece of literature is written in West Saxon, so that automatically, you know, makes West Saxon take off like a rocket. And at that point, this is before the year 1000, we could have predicted, boy, West Saxon is going to become what Tuscan has become in Italy. The language of literature, the most prestigious dialect, eventually the dialect that will emerge, and in the future, English will be a form of German. But we didn't take into account the fact that a few decades later, Normans from the north of France, and speaking one form of French, Norman French, invade the island and beat the crap out of those Germanic tribes. In the year 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror, a Norman, French-speaking guy, brutally puts down the resistance, burns all the villages from the point where they landed all the way to London, and most importantly, they eventually killed every single member of the aristocracy and every single member of the ecclesiastical authority. Archbishops, bishops, abbots, you name it, all the way down, dead. And with that, they replaced the upper classes with French-speaking upper classes. They suppressed the emerging scribal tradition in what we now would call Old English, in West Saxon. And now anything that gets written in the island gets written in Norman French. So that created a very interesting situation. The Normans get kicked out in the early 1200s, so we're talking about roughly 200 years. For those 200 years, the authorities, everybody manning organizations which have any kind of authority, ecclesiastical, governmental, commercial, or whatever, speak French, and the masses, the peasant masses, are allowed to speak whatever the hell they want to speak. So what happened? Variation increased, right? West Saxon was beginning to emerge, and even though he had not still stamped down all the variation, if he had been given 200 more years and several more works of literature had been written in West Saxon, perhaps the variation would have been reduced. But you get the Normans coming in, killing the English-speaking aristocracy and archbishops and bishops and so on, replacing them with French-speaking ones, patronizing French literature, so the masses don't have anyone to enforce the norms. So what happened is that whatever the variation that already existed there, but that was relatively centripetal, becomes centrifugal. And in 200 years, what was basically German, or a Germanic language, becomes early Middle English, which is very far away from modern English, but if you read it today, it looks and feels like English. It doesn't feel like German. How do we know that? What characteristics are going to do that? Well, the very first thing is inflections. In Indo-European languages, both the Germanic and the Latin and Greek forms, inflections are the last syllables of a word that transmit grammatical information. In modern English, we have a few inflections. S for plural, you attach that inflection and you go from one chair to several chairs. You have ed for past tense, for some verbs, anyway, regular verbs. And you have ing for the gerund. But that's it. Whereas if you look at German, or you look at Spanish, or you look at French, every single word is inflected. This is why it is so hard for English-speaking native speakers of English to learn Spanish or to learn French. You go from a language in which there is a single or two verb inflections to a language in which every person, first person of singular, second person, third person, and the three persons of the plural, has different inflections for every tense, present, past, future, subjunctive, the complex tenses. They are literally 100 different inflections for every verb, for every tense, for every person. Of course, there are also inflections for nouns that denote gender. Things are gendered in Spanish, in French, and in German. They are not gendered anymore in English, with some exceptions. So what happened to those inflections? Those inflections, in fact, were lost between the Battle of Hastings and the moment the Normans get kicked out. Well, all those masses of English-speaking peasants had inherited from their German ancestors a habit, just a habit, the habit of stressing the first syllable. So they would say mathematics. I mean, they probably wouldn't use that word, but you know. Also think about stress. Stress is a material thing. Stress is the amount of energy that you put in a certain syllable. Stress in German or in Germanic dialects tends to be on the same syllable, whether it's the root syllable, the first syllable, or other. Whereas stress in Latin-derived languages are all over the place in different words. Think, for instance, of certain words in English derived from Latin. Family has it in the first syllable. Family. Familiar. Familiarity. So it's family, familiar, familiarity. It's in different syllables. It's just a habit. Stress is not even part of language, properly speaking. It's not part of grammar, it's not part of semantics, but it is part of the materiality of language, because it's how much energy you put in a particular syllable. Now the energy that gets, the syllable that gets an energy, gets your attention. I mean, if you ever want to shorten a word, you shorten that word towards the syllables that get the stress. Thus, if you want to shorten mathematics to math, you pick the first syllable, because mathematics. But if you ever want to reduce neighborhood, you don't pick the first syllable. You don't say, hey, we're from the same nay. We're from the same hood, right? Because it's neighborhood. So, despite the fact that stress doesn't really belong to language, it affects linguistic evolution, because it affects where you put your attention. Those masses of Germanic peasants had inherited the habit of stressing the first syllable, and because inflections are always the last syllable, attention began drifting away from those syllables, and they began to be literally eroded away. Just like a rock is eroded away by rain, and slowly all the stitches began disappearing through erosion. So this is another reason why it's important to think about language as something material. It can be subjected to both accretion and erosion, just like rocks can. And in those 200 years, most of the inflections that characterize English disappeared through a process that we today call clipping. The snipping out, or the cutting out, or the scissoring out of the inflections. Now, clipping was not a conscious process. It is not as one good morning, one fine morning, some English peasant woke up and told his kid, I feel like clipping myself a couple of inflections today. You know, what inflections should we clip today, boy? So nobody does that, right? It took 200 years. If we assume that they got married around 15 years old, 16 years old, well, that's about 12 generations. 12 generations is good enough or long enough for an unconscious process in which you are disfavoring the root syllable and then taking attention away from the last syllables for those inflections to begin disappearing. Once your inflections disappear, or rather, as the process of losing inflections disappears, you begin losing grammatical markers. You begin losing the way to distinguish really fast between a verb and a noun, for instance. Because nouns with inflections, you can tell, they're pluralized or they are genderized, and verbs with inflections, well, they are in a particular tense. So you can tell what the verb and the noun is. Once inflections are gone, verbs and nouns begin to sound the same. So it becomes then a part of your obligation to begin freezing or fixing the word order. Because now word order, noun, verb, noun, or subject, verb, object, becomes very, very important. And so the word order became fixed. Now this is just, I say, statistical. People tend to speak in a fixed word order in English due to the lack of, it's the only way you can convey grammaticality now. That's why colorless green ideas sleep furiously sounds grammatical, because it obeys that word order. There is one exception to this, and that exception is Yoda. Yoda will not say, "May the Force be with you," like every other Jedi would. No. He has to say, "With you, may the Force be," right? But that's only because he's short and green. So don't try to do it yourselves. Don't try to sound like Yoda, you're going to sound ridiculous. Okay? Fixed word order now has become at least partly obligatory in English, and if you depart from it, you depart from it from some literary reasons, or in order to make a character sound a little wiser or something. But for most other people, colorless green people, fixed word order is now obligatory. So in 200 years, well, what's a basically Germanic soup of dialects gave rise to early Middle English, as well in the form of many dialects of early Middle English, with some of the dialects, the dialect of London rising, some of those, and so as well as some of the dialects of other regional capitals. In other words, the exact same process as was occurring in the continent began to happen there. Next chapter in our story then begins here, the year 1500 roughly. By then, the most famous or the most prestigious of the vernaculars, the English from London, the Spanish from France, the French from Spanish from France. Cut. The Spanish from Madrid, the French from Paris began to rise, as well as some other regional capitals, and they began to leave behind a bunch of dialects that were considered either too poor or too unprestigious to even be considered a language, and so now they began a completely different battle. At that point, in 1492 to be exact, the next chapter of the story begins with a guy, a pioneer called Antonio de Nebrija. Spanish guy, Spanish grammarian, who created something he called artificial Castilian. He called it that because he knew it was artificial. Before that, there were no books of grammar. There were books of Latin grammar, to be sure, written by classic grammarians from the Roman Empire, but there were no books of grammar for French, no books of grammar for English, no books of grammar for Spanish, no books of grammar for Tuscan. You learn those patterns You pick them up by listening to your parents use that language. We're going to talk about that in the very last class when we talk about neural networks. In fact, I'm probably bringing that up tomorrow night, but nevertheless, I will be applying it to this because neural networks are pattern recognition devices. Neural networks show you that you can learn something without being explicitly told the line. We've already encountered that distinction. Know-how versus know-that. But what Antonio de Nebrija did was to formalize those grammatical rules. He took, of course, the language of the upper classes of Madrid, the language of the court of Madrid, and sat down to cast in an explicit way all the grammatical rules. The present tense must be this way, the past tense must be this way, the subjunctive must be this way, if you're going to use a complex verb, it must be used this way, and so on and so forth. Those rules did not exist before. Nebrija knew perfectly well that he was taking patterns of usage and casting them into a form they had never been casted before. A book of grammar. And, this is very interesting, he dedicated the book of grammar to the Queen. In a political move, in a blatant political move. A couple of weeks or a few weeks before Nebrija visited the Queen to offer her the grammar, Christopher Columbus had visited the Queen, Queen Isabella, to ask her for money and resources to find a new route to India. Of course, Christopher Columbus did not know that the planet was larger than he thought. He was going to stumble upon America, and he was never going to reach India. But nevertheless, what he was proposing is, look, the Portuguese already broke the monopoly of trade with China and trade with Islam by bypassing the Mediterranean, rounding Africa, and going directly to the Indian Ocean. Well, why don't we do the same thing only across the Atlantic? We promise you riches, we promise you gold, we promise you spices, we promise you luxury goods, cheaper than the Portuguese can get. Christopher Columbus got his ships, got his money. A few weeks later, Antonio de Nebrija shows up and proposes a similar project to the Queen. Not how to extend her empire commercially around the world, but how to extend her empire interiorly. Nebrija basically asked the Queen this: how does your Majesty know that thy commands are being understood everywhere, anywhere other than Madrid? After all, the Leonese-speaking people and the Aragonese-speaking people and the Catalan-speaking people and the people that are right now beginning to speak Portuguese, they probably don't even understand your commands. What you need is a standard form of Castilian. A form of Castilian that's written in books, and because it's written in books, it will be as sterile and as enduring as written Latin was in its time. Unfortunately for Nebrija, he was ahead of his time. He was about 100 years ahead of his time. The Queen just looked at him like going, huh? And he didn't get his money. But 100 years later, the project took off. Not in Spain, but in Italy. In 1582, the Italians the Florentines created Tosca Academy of Language. In 1637, the French, or the Parisians, create the French Academy of Language. And early in the 1700s, Spain finally catches up and creates the Spanish Academy of Language. Now these are organizations, institutional organizations with an authority structure, staffed by grammarians and experts on language. So it was not a solo show like Antonio de Nebrija. It was an organization that has now been appointed by government to create a fixed form of their particular dialects. Let's freeze language in the way it is. Let's remove all the variation so that it doesn't begin to change anymore. When you read the notes from the meetings, for instance, of the French Academy of Language in the early 1600s, the first half of the 1600s. You read them, and then you can see that they're aware of what they're doing. They say things like, you know, if Tuscan continues to change, who is going to be able to understand Dante, Boccaccio, Petrarca? And if French continues to change, who is going to be able to read all the classics in the French literature? 200 years from now, 300 years from now, look at what happened to written Latin. We have to freeze language in its current form, and the only way of freezing it is by devising linguistic engineering methods or devices that can eliminate the variation. And what they produced was official dictionaries such that if you were a word and you were not in the dictionary, then you were not a word of standard Tuscan. If you were a word and you were not in the dictionary of the French Academy of Language, then you were simply not a word in standard French, period. It doesn't matter what you're playing, but in my town we use that word. Yeah, in your town there are a bunch of hits, you know. You don't use that word in French. Official dictionaries, official grammars, just like the ones done by Nebrija, and official rules of pronunciation, published, of course, as books. And with this, they managed to reduce the variation. Now, as it happens, just as a matter of historical fact, standard French, standard Castilian, standard Tuscan, and eventually standard English were only spoken by the upper classes and by the rising middle classes, which were anxious to sound like the upper classes. The moment there's social mobility and you want your kids to be like we do want them today, better off than you were when you were a kid. Most couples want their kids to be better off than they were when they were kids. Well, then I'm going to teach you the standard language, and I want to enforce the standard language at home because I want you to speak that language in your way up to a better life, to a better, you know, they need to speak the language of the upper classes. So they were all the rising middle classes were happy buyers of these official dictionaries, official grammar, and rules of pronunciation. The rest of the masses, though, the lower middle classes, the working classes, were outside the scope. The rest of the population, those were the majority of the population, were only brought into the fold of the standard language in the late 1800s with the creation of compulsory primary education in the standard. This was a process that was not at the same time everywhere, it was staggered, but nevertheless, beginning in the last few decades of the 19th century, primary school, elementary school, grammar school, as they call it in English very appropriately, began to be compulsory. The word compulsory is very important for us here because, of course, our replicators that transmit themselves or make copies of themselves to enforce obligation. So any word in the blackboard that connotes obligation is important for us, or at least for this class. Thanks to this, thanks to the fact that as kids, 6-year-old kids, we were processed by this system of education, we don't even notice today that we're speaking an artificial language. We think we're speaking standard English, and standard English has always existed. Or we're speaking standard Spanish, and this is what the essence of Spanish is. Well, it is not. It is an artificial form invented by an organization and then propagated to an educational system. Notice the difference between those two. In this case, and that's the reason why they did not succeed, is not as thoroughly, because they were single organizations. They may have had branches in a few important towns, but the main important organization was in the capital, the regional capital, Paris, London, Madrid. But this is a system of organizations. It's an assemblage of organizations. Every primary school in every little town, every medium-sized town, every large town across the country. Of course, by the 19th century, Spain already exists as a country, France already exists as a country, England was acquired, it was unified prematurely, it had already existed as a country for centuries. So you needed to now be able to spread those replicators throughout the country. And in order to do that, you needed an organizational infrastructure. You needed those entities that we have been calling organizations to actually perform the transmission of the standard, to the point where we don't even notice it anymore. We think we're simply speaking the only form of English, the only form of Spanish that there is. So with this, a lot of the variation was reduced. And the moment the variation was reduced, we should expect a certain result. There shouldn't be any new forms of Spanish. There shouldn't be any new forms of French. There shouldn't be any new forms of English. There shouldn't be any new forms of Italian. Right? There's slangs. There are local jargons, technological jargons. You know, carpenters have their own jargon. Blacksmiths have their own jargon, and so on. There are jargons that belong to different professions, and that is a source of variation. There's slangs. You know, you grow up in different high schools, and in high school is one of the main sports to invent new words, and particularly getting a new word that you invent, you know, to become popular in high school. That's like a major achievement, right? And that is a source of variation. But the variation is now centripetal, and therefore is not giving rise to neo-Spanishes or neo-French or neo-Englishes or neo-Germans or neo-anything, with one exception that we're going to talk about right now. So that is the second period, the rise of the standards. Now notice too, this is an important thing to notice, that there is no such thing as an English Academy of Language. There were authoritative dictionaries, like Dr. Johnson's dictionary in England and Webster dictionary, the Webster dictionary in the United States, which have plenty of authority. In the 19th century, a famous case, a bill was thrown out of the English Parliament because it contained a word that was not in Dr. Johnson's dictionary. I mean, that by itself shows you that even without an academy, a very popular dictionary, in particular one that is enforced by the government, at least in official circles, can have that homogenizing effect. But nevertheless, English is more heterogeneous than French, Spanish, or Italian, or for that matter, German, because it doesn't have an academy, because there is no active enforcement. There is such thing as a standard English, and English has been frozen in time. Think, for instance, and the way you can see that is by certain frozen accidents that occur in language. Think of this, for instance. You have I, in terms of personal pronouns, and then you have we, singular and plural. You have he and she, and you have they, singular and plural. But then you have you, and you have you. That can't be right. That can't be right. There's something wrong about that. Why the same word for both? Well, as thou and thy began to be eliminated from the language, and you had already replaced one of the two, language was frozen. It was reproductively isolated from its sources of renewal and renovation, and this particular error was frozen into the language. Now, it wouldn't have to be that way. I have been to New Jersey, people. Believe it or not, I have been to New Jersey. And I know that in New Jersey they say "use guys." Use guys, what's up? Now I know also that in the South they would say something like "y'all." Those are perfectly good replicators. There's absolutely nothing wrong with them. The only problem is they sound vulgar to us. And why do they sound vulgar to us? Because we were educated in compulsory primary education in the standard. That's the only reason they sound vulgar. Not because there's any vulgarity inherited in them. In fact, the correct thing to do would be to say, hey, you get out, because you are the mistake. These guys are organic replicators that emerge in actual speech. They have every bit as much right to occupy your space. Are we going to ever let them do that? I don't think so. So English, despite that it does not have an academy, is frozen, relatively. Less so than Spanish, less so than French, less so than Italian, and perhaps that's why it has a little more vitality. At any rate, once the standards became asserted in their own countries, they began to compete against one another to see who would become the international standard. And this was, of course, part and parcel of colonialism. The Spanish conquistadors brought Spanish to all of Latin America. The English conquistadors brought English to all the lands that they conquered. The French brought French to all the lands that they conquered. And they began to fight with one another to see who would become the international standard. Prior to this fight, the international standard was written Latin. Good old written Latin. The one that we talked about 1,000 years ago. If you were a diplomat, you would speak with written Latin, using the rules of pronunciation that were invented by our queen. If you were some head of state and you needed to speak to another head of state and you were, say, Russian and he was Greek, you would speak in written Latin. But by the 1700s, 1800s, French, the French of Paris, standard French, began to replace written Latin as the language of diplomacy and eventually the language of transportation. In the 1920s, if you were a ship captain and you had to dock on a port that was not one of your, was not a stop that you had pre-programmed, so you needed to talk via radio with the authorities at the port and say you were Russian and they were Greek, you would not speak to them in Russian or in Greek. You would speak to them in French. French by now had become the international lingua franca. And it continued in that role. It had already won, except for World War II. World War II witnessed not only the defeat of the French against the Nazis, but the occupation of France by the Nazis for 4 or 5 years. And that is the most humiliating thing that can possibly happen to a culture, including to its language. And in some bizarre twist of fate, French lost its prestige in those 4 years. By the time the French emerged from Nazi occupation, they hated to realize that their rival, England, the language of their rival had now become the international lingua franca. If in the 1950s you were flying a plane, say you were a Russian pilot, and you wanted to talk to the control tower in an airport in Greece, you don't talk to them. You didn't talk to them in French. You crashed your plane if you talked to them in French. You talk to them in English. And that is the truth to this day. So the battle to become the international standard took different forms. The French had the advantage for a long time. I'm going to mention a few details only before moving on. First of all, the last continent to become colonized, Africa. Africa, of course, had been colonized at coasts, particularly during the slave trade and so on, but not the interior of Africa, because they had their own biological barriers. Malaria, yellow fever, a bunch of diseases for which the Europeans did not have vaccines or any way of protecting them. So prior to the 19th century, they had been kept away from the center of Africa. With the availability of vaccines and much more organized military medicine, they were finally able, the Europeans, to carve Africa up among them. So there was Belgian Africa, Africa, German Africa, Italian Africa, French Africa, English Africa. With World War I, which the Italians, the Germans, and so on lost, they lost their territories, which were absorbed into the French or the British empires. And so, at the beginning of the 20th century, Africa had been divided neatly into basically Francophone Africa, that is African-speaking French, and Anglophone Africa, African states speaking English. To this day, they vote as a bloc in the United Nations. They have linguistic links to each other that transcend political alliances and other more short-term goals that they may have. They vote as a bloc, and that shows you that it was a good idea for the French and a good idea for the British to propagate their replicators, to send replicators out there to become more replicated as new people are born and begin speaking your language, because eventually that was going to be useful in fights at the UN. For instance, when the UN was created after World War II, French, now the language of a humiliated nation, was considered just one language among others. But thanks to the votes of the Francophone African nations, French eventually became an official language of the UN on a par with English. So it paid for the French to invest on that. Another front in the war was what we call today news agencies. You know, everybody has seen newspaper articles where at the beginning of the article says source, the Associated Press, or source, Reuters, or source, some other news agency. A news agency is an organization, typically a large organization, staffed by reporters who are all over the world, and they are just there to get snippets of news, not to write long opinion pieces or even long analytical pieces. They are just to write news in the most straightforward way and then sell the news. Sell the news to local newspapers that don't have the resources to send reporters to Africa, send reporters to the Balkans, to send reporters to Central Asia, or to wherever there's a war, to wherever there's a new catastrophe. The news agencies have reporters all over the world, and they've had them since the 18th century. Reuters, that still exists, is the British news agency or the English news agency. Havas was the French news agency. Today it's disappeared, but there's a new news agency with a new name. I can't remember right now the name in French. The Russians have the news agency using Russian. The Chinese have a news agency using Chinese. The news agencies are important, first of all, because they were the original users of the telegraph. And telegraphs allowed for linguistic replicators now to move at the speed of light. You know, you didn't need news to move in horse or news to move by people transmitting those news by foot. You could, or even by locomotive. You could send it by telegraph, and that was the fastest way in which replicators could move around the world. And more importantly, because of the incredibly large number of words that they emit every day. We're talking about millions of words in standard English or standard French that are being broadcasted and sold to all kinds of local newspapers that don't have the resources. The New York Times, for instance, doesn't buy that many news from news agencies because they have their own reporters. But a local newspaper in a small town in Iowa or in a small town in somewhere else, they need the news agencies. And that means that the news agencies help the propagation and replication of standard language replicators. And so Reuters, the war between Reuters and Havas in the 18th and 19th centuries and continuing in the 20th century was a linguistic war. Finally, we can have the question now of, well, okay, so standard French, standard English were homogenized, or at least their variation was reduced to being centripetal. Hasn't there been any episode since then in which, by some bizarre circumstance, new heterogeneity is injected into these international languages in such a way as to produce new forms of French and new forms of English? Well, the most important example, the answer is yes, and the most important example of that is slave plantations. This is the place where African-American English was born. This is the place where Jamaican English was born. And this is the place where Haitian French, the French spoken in Haiti, were born. Those three languages are three new languages. They are not broken forms of language. William Landa was the first one to show that black English is as systematic as standard English in every respect. It has its own set of words. It has its own set of grammatical patterns that are systematic and methodical. And it has its own sounds. Sounds are not the part of that language that varies the most. That's probably the part that overlaps the standard English the most. But nevertheless, it is very systematic. It's not a form of poorly spoken English. It's not broken English. It's a new language that was born thanks to slaves. See why? And let's concentrate here on Jamaican English. And Haitian French. First of all, if you were a master of a slave plantation, the owner of a slave plantation, owner of the slaves, you would go to the slave markets and deliberately buy Africans from different linguistic backgrounds. That wasn't hard at all. Africa is the continent with the most linguistic heterogeneity of them all. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of different dialects spoken to this day by different tribes in Africa. Different lingua francas have emerged now and then. Swahili is the very last one. It emerged in the 19th century as a necessary second language so that you can speak from one, people from one tribe can speak to another tribe. But back when the slave trade was swinging, late 1700s, early 1800s, when it was at its most intense, people from Africa or from different regions of Africa could speak to one another. So the masters of slave plantations deliberately picked slaves from different linguistic backgrounds for a very good reason. If they cannot communicate with one another, they cannot organize a rebellion. They cannot, in fact, form a community. And that is what slave owners wanted. They wanted slave plantations to be an artificial collocation of people with a sex ratio tilted completely towards males so that there would never be any kind of regular family life. And from different linguistic backgrounds so that they would not develop the tight links that make up a community, and therefore the emergent property of communities, which is solidarity. Once solidarity emerges, then rebellions among those slave plantations would have been much more harder to put down. Enforcement costs would have gone up. So in a very wily and sneaky way, slave owners picked Africans from different backgrounds. Now you can imagine, in the conditions of a slave plantation where you don't have a real community life, you survive a trip across the Atlantic in which you were placed like sardines on top of one another, and perhaps 3/4 of the slaves of that ship died, and you were the only one to survive, and then you're collocated in an artificial community where you cannot even speak to one another. They began to invent their own language. And the process of invention of new languages is a two-step process. First comes a process that we today call pidginization. This simply means a great simplification. A lot of words that are redundant, that is, that you can still understand the sentence even without them, are taken away. Think of the verb to be. You can say, a rose is red, or simply say, a red rose. And for all practical purposes, you say the same thing. So the verb to be can go. A bunch of other things like that can go. Pigeons, as these simplified languages are called, have existed for a long, long time, perhaps for as long as language, in what is called contact situations between different cultures. These are typically trading situations. So for instance, in the Mediterranean, when the places where the Italians and the Portuguese went to trade with the markets of the Levant with Islamic peoples, there was a pigeon called sabir, which was a very, very simplified form of Italian, a very, very simplified form of Arabic, and good enough so that you could barter with it. You didn't have to be able to write literature in it, so all the expressive resources that are necessary for literature or creativity are gone. But nevertheless, you can perfectly well conduct say a haggling, you know. No, I'm not going to give you 2 of this for 3 of that. I want 3 of this for 3 of that, and so on. So you need a pigeon, you need a very simple language, and sabir emerged spontaneously and by itself at those in those trade contact situations. As time went by and the Portuguese became more important than the Italians, sabir changed, and it began to include more Portuguese-sounding words than Italian-sounding words. So pigeons are constantly changing. And another thing that pigeons have in common is that they tend to disappear the moment the contact situation disappears. So if a new trade route was started that now bypasses that particular port where sabir was spoken, and there's no traders speaking sabir, sabir disappears. So in slave plantations, they did a similar thing. Here, the contact situation was, of course, a very different one. Was the forced contact of slaves from different linguistic backgrounds. But in the urgency of the situation and to be able to communicate the sadness and the anguish of their situation to each other and to try to have some kind of minimal community life, they began to take whatever words they could understand from each other in their original African languages and began to simplify the master's language. English in the case of Jamaican slaves, French in the case of slaves in Haiti. And by simplifying it, they created a pidgin. And when you read the diaries of the owners of slaves, you know, they write, you know, I went to the place where the slaves have their beds or their bedrooms, and I heard them speak some kind of baby talk, you know, kind of a broken English or retarded English, they might as well have said, because what they meant was precisely that. Oh, poor guys, they don't even know what they're talking about. They're trying to speak English, but they can't because, of course, they're inferior people. Today we know that the process of pigeonization is a highly creative job, particularly in the conditions of a slave plantation, when you're not supposed to even have time to think about these things. It takes work to be able to come up with a pidgin, and it takes work to stabilize a pidgin within a particular plantation. Pigeonization is not a badly spoken language. It's the beginning of a new language. The second step is called creolization. And it's a re-enrichment. Of a pidgin. Creolization typically occurs in the first 1 or 2 generations after the slaves have been freed. It can occur in a variety of ways. It can occur by borrowing. You can borrow whatever forms of the verb to be. You eliminate it from the pidgin, or whatever adjectives, or whatever other relatively non ordinary and widely used words that you had dropped, you can now borrow them. But another way of doing it is by letting kids, when they're like 5 or 6 years old, speak and enrich the language on their own. As everybody knows, kids, when they're like young, not only can they learn a foreign language easier, they tend to invent words, and then they can play with those invented words with other kids. If you're a middle-class parent who aspires to become upper class, and therefore you are desperate to enforce the standard, the moment your kids begin talking weird things, they begin using aimed, for instance, you go, no, that's bad, right? Because you want them to be better off. You want them to speak the standard, to speak like the upper classes, so you regulate their speech. But if you're an ex-slave, first-generation ex-slave, and your kids begin to fool around with the pidgin and begin adding new words, you let them do that. And in 2 or 3 generations, they can manage to add enough new vocabulary to a pidgin to make it into a Creole. Now, there's all sorts of sources of, as I say, they can borrow terms. You know, by the time this occurred, there was already relatively cheap newspapers that you could buy, so you could read new terms, or have the one person in your village that reads bring new terms to you. There's a whole variety of ways of re-enriching. But after creolization, a new language is born. And what this means is that Standard English and Standard French, who had been artificially homogenized and therefore had been rendered sterile as written Latin had been 1,000 years before, were re-injected with variation by those African slaves, and therefore were made capable of giving birth to new languages. Today, the field of Pidgin and Creole linguistics is exploding. Whereas 40 years ago, it was a small little corner of linguistics and of historical linguistics, and very few people spend their careers doing Pidgin and Creole linguistics. Today, it's a hot field. And it's a hot field because people have realized that perhaps the processes that took place in slave plantations are similar to in different conditions, different circumstances, to the processes that created languages in the first place. Think, for instance, what happened to English during the Norman invasion. All that clipping of inflections and that fixing of word order is a kind of pidginization, it's a kind of simplification. What the peasants in England did during the Norman invasion was to simplify German, to simplify West Saxon and a variety of other dialects, by eliminating all those inflections and then fulfilling all those grammatical functions via word order. Once the Normans left, when the French were kicked out of England, and particularly once the English won a couple of great battles, the Battle of Agincourt, and another battle that I can't remember right now, using a new weapon called the longbow that could penetrate French armor, and defeated the French in a way that was definitive, they stopped being afraid of the French, as they had been right after the Norman invasion, of course, and began to borrow freely from the French. In the 1400s, about 50% of the vocabulary of English entered English. Literally, thousands of words flowed from the continent, whether Latin, Spanish, or French, from some Romance source, into English, to the point that this day, 50% of the vocabulary of English is of foreign origin. That sounds to me like a creolization. That sounds to me like a clipping of inflections and a simplification of German, and then a Romance borrowing period in which you re-enrich your language with new resources, because all those words were anglicized, and therefore that became something that sounded like English, but nevertheless you can trace them to their origins. So English, in a way, we could say that it was a language produced by pidginization and creolization. Whether that theory is true or not, it doesn't really matter for my argument. All I've been trying to prove to you guys tonight is that no variation or centripetal variation, variation under control, produces languages that cannot produce new species, Whereas excess variation or large amounts of heterogeneity or centripetal variation injects a language with the capacity to produce new species of languages, new dialects, brand new languages that come and inhabit the world. And if this is true, and I believe that I've given you plenty of evidence to at least make it likely, then language is perhaps what I've been saying it is. A population of replicators, just like genes. A population of replicators which is material, and which undergoes material processes of erosion, of clipping, of re-enrichment, of accretion, just as if it was any other material entity. Okay, guys? So all I try to do today is make this idea plausible. Because the materialism that I've been trying to teach you for the last couple of weeks needs to be able to account for symbolic practices. We cannot just say, well, yes, the biology is material, and industry is material, and transportation is material, but everything symbolic is beyond the material. What I try to do today is to tell you, or to try to convince you that even the most mental stuff, when you look at it carefully and historically, can be considered to be material, acoustic matter that undergoes evolutionary processes. Okay, guys. That's it for today's class. On Thursday, we're going to tackle a very, very different subject, transportation. We're going to see how different forms of transportation, from sea transport to locomotives to cars, have affected the shape of cities in different ways. Today we talked about the languages spoken within cities, but not how language affects the very materiality of cities, and that is because language doesn't really do that, but transportation does. Transportation actually changes the shape of cities and shapes the very infrastructure of cities. So we're going to talk a bit, and of course cities are places defined by movement. By the movement of goods into the city, of imports, and the movement of exports outside the city, the movement of immigrants inside the city, and the movement outward of immigrants, the movement of news, the movement of diseases. Everything is in motion in a city. And so when you add transportation, you are basically now channeling all those motive forces, all those flows, and giving them a technological vehicle on top of which now they can move faster and they can influence more things. So we're going to dedicate the entire class on Thursday night to the history of transportation and how it has affected urban form. Now for the famous question and answer period. Yes?
So you have outside your the geography that you're going to be talking about, but I'm wondering if South America had a lot of slavery. What made it different there that they didn't develop so many co-realization?
Very good question. I was hoping somebody was going to ask that question. You're right. There are almost no Portuguese Creoles. You know, there's one called Pimiento or something like that, and I don't believe that there's a Spanish Creole. The main difference is this. In order for a pidgin and a Creole to acquire their own identity, you need the slaves to have a certain amount of social distance from the masters. In other words, you need a certain amount of isolation. You need the masters not caring about the language that they speak, and certainly not intermarrying with them. Because otherwise that social distance disappears, and then the pidgin begins to blend into the major language. In the lands that were conquered by the Spanish conquistadors, as we saw last class, they did not occupy a populational vacuum as in the Neo-Europes. But even though they killed a lot of people with their diseases, there were still plenty of survivors. And there was a lot more intermarriage between the Spanish and Indians, creating a mestizo class, and a lot more intermarriage between the Spanish and blacks, creating a mulatto class. Those intermediate mulatto and mestizo classes provided a bridge between the must have been process of pidginization, but but then the original pidgins, through mulattoes or through mestizos, blended again with the original language. They probably did create variants, varieties, just like as they exist in the United States, right? The United States doesn't really have dialects. You don't go to Texas and they speak a different dialect. They speak with a different twang. They speak with a different accent. And so a few of the sounds are different, and perhaps some mannerisms and things like that. But in the United States, we don't really have dialects because they have lacked the appropriate isolation. By the time language began to evolve when it's in the United States, the railroad already existed, the telegraph already existed, and both of them fought against isolation. Both of them shortened distances and bridged geographical barriers. Now, in this particular case, we're talking about social isolation rather than geographical isolation, but a mestizo class, which is very evident in Mexico, you know, that's the one country that I can talk of. The majority of people are mestizo, which, in other words, they're combinators, almost no white people. I'm like the only person. And not so much with mulattoes in Mexico because we didn't really have that many plantations, but in other Caribbean areas where the Spanish were, say in Cuba, there's a very large mulatto class, which again, it did not have as much prestige as the criollos, white criollos, right? But nevertheless served as a bridge to the slave plantations and therefore diminished the amount of separation. So whatever pidgins that did emerge in those plantations eventually disappeared. Whereas in Jamaica and Haiti, neither the French nor the English were the type of culture that were willing to mix with the locals. It was extremely low, small amount of intermarriage, although it did exist. And therefore, the slaves were kept relatively isolated, which was good for their language, because it was not reabsorbed into the master language. Right? That's my hypothesis anyway. Right? But you put your finger on a very important subject. That is a live subject in Pidgin and Creole linguistics today. Why not Spain? Why not Portugal? Why only we have one single Creole? Tapamiento. Whereas when the Spanish is spoken in all of Latin America. In fact, Spanish is, I believe, the second language most spoken in the world right next to Chinese. I mean, it's the second largest in terms of number of speakers. You would think that with all those complex situations, there would have been a lot more of those pidgins. But if there's no social distance, you get reabsorbed into the master language again. Yeah?
Because of the lack of English academy and possibly already a creolization of English, does that make English, or do you think that made English a more apt language for an international language as opposed to French?
Yeah, I hate to say that, but yeah. I mean, I hate to say that because it's siding with the language that I happen to speak, right? Yeah. But yes, I do believe so. I mean, I believe that's why people actually resent it less. The French should resent it the least of all, right? Because they gave us 50% of their language, so hey, now, be on the receiving end, man. I mean, now that we're going to send, like, a couple of million words in your, in your direction. They are way too purist to do that. But in Latin America, there's variations as to how English words are accepted. In some places, for instance, DNA is called ADN because that's the word in Spanish, that's the spelling in Spanish. But in other Latin American, they don't even bother to change it. They just say DNA in the same order as DNA. There's a lot less of a kind of nationalism about language. Of course, those were ex-colonies. It's not Spain itself. I'm sure in Spain itself, there's a lot more reticence to mix with the English, just like the French are. When you're using the language of the ex-colonial powers, you have a lot less respect for it than if you're living in the country that gave rise to that language in the first place. Yes, I believe that English has kind of won the right to be the lingua franca in a way, and English, precisely because it's used in different ways by different people, is being re-injected with heterogeneity in that same way. The Japanese do a marvelous work of shortening. We were talking about that the other day, of shortening English words, making them sound Japanese, but at the same time they are neologisms, clearly, that are derived from English. But but it's not as if anyone even noticed, and it's a highly creative way of doing it, because it's not importing the whole word and then using the whole word. It's actually adapting the word to your language. For a while I thought the internet was going to be, you know, a kind of an imperial device for English to conquer the whole world in a bad way, to homogenize the whole world. But apparently the internet has done the opposite, has re-injected English with heterogeneity. Just look at all those acronyms in texting and even from the early days of the internet, before the web and before cell phones and so on, it was considered bad form in chat rooms to correct people for their spelling. In other words, if you were in a chat room and somebody spelled apple with just one P or something like that, and you actually mentioned that, the other people in the chat room would say, like, get out of here. You're correcting grammar in a chat room, are you out of your mind? Which means that variation, there was no enforcement of the standard. And as we've seen throughout the class, the moment enforcement goes down, variation goes up and becomes centripetal. So, in addition to the fact, of course, that today there are mechanical translators that are relatively good, that can translate web pages into any language. And a translator back in the 70s, mechanical translators were very, very bad. There's a very famous case of a Russian-English translator in which, to test it, you would feed it a sentence in English, let it translate it into Russian, and then use that sentence in Russian and translate it into back in English to see what happened. And so they fed it into English. You know, this was like an IBM super translator device, right? And they fed the sentence, the flesh is weak, but the spirit is strong. Right? I think it's from the Bible or something like that. And now it came, you know, it went into Russian and came out into English like, the steak is good. No, the steak is bad, but the vodka is good. Right? They translate spirit, which has a link, you know, spirits, alcoholic spirits. You know, they translated that was vodka, and flesh, which speaks really of earthly pleasures that make you sin. It's not really speaking about meat, was translated into steak. So once the diplomats saw this, it's like, let's not use this to prevent nuclear warfare for these people. Because, you know, whatever message we send is going to be like, you punk-ass little bitches, try to nuke me or something. Even if you were to be sending some other message like, you know, we want peace and love with you. But today...
There was another one. It was out of sight and out of mind. It was fed in. It came out as invisible lunacy.
That's right, which to Khrushchev was like an insult. Okay, let's start the Cuban Missile Crisis. They just called me a lunatic. But today mechanical translators are pretty good, particularly when not translating oral language. Like, I can imagine a mechanical translator trying to keep up with me right now. But web pages are relatively formal, are typically written in a standard language, so you can consult basically dictionaries and spelling checkers and so on are already available. And they do a pretty decent job. And so the web never really became the English-dominated realm that I thought at one point it was going to become. But even if it had, the web and other technological devices had allowed for the introduction of new variants. This is not actually new. The telegraph, particularly via the news agencies, and in interaction with cheap newspapers that needed flashy headlines, began to create neologisms in those headlines that would rapidly enter the casual register of language, and then even become part of a dictionary, or an official dictionary. And of course, you know, newspapermen and reporters do try to use language in their own stylistic ways and to come up with catchy headlines. They need to kind of torture language in certain ways. And so both the telegraphic style of the news agencies and the headline style of the newspapers, but this is particularly true of what was called penny newspapers. You know, these were born in the 1840s, first in England and then in New York. They are important in addition for the role in language because they gave us the business model for the net. Right? Penny newspapers were too cheap, they were worth 1 penny, so you couldn't make money selling the newspapers. You had to sell something else. So they invented the idea of selling the attention of the readers to advertisers, which didn't exist until then. And they made money that way. You know, even if you don't look at all the ads, which shows you, by the way, that attention is a form of labor. You can get tired by focusing your attention somewhere. And it's free labor performed by the readers, because the readers are getting a service, which is an almost cheap, almost free newspaper, but advertisers are using their attention. As we all know, that business model became the business model for radio, it became the business model for at least free TV, broadcast TV, and now it's a model for the web. So certain innovations that come along as kind of ways of making this business model work can have repercussions that go on for 2 centuries. Yes?
I've always been curious about the French that's spoken in Quebec, because actually my grandparents are French Canadian, and my grandmother, who was schooled in Parisian French, educated French, was always yelling at my grandfather for saying things wrong because he speaks, this like really, she refers to as dirty French.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you sort of know anything about how that adapted and how that came to be, because it's completely different languages.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm not, people I don't know the history of Quebec's French, but I can imagine that it diverged from standard French at some point. I'm not even sure how old is Quebec City. I mean, whether, and to what. The best explanation I can come up with is that it was clearly out of the jurisdiction of the French Academy of Language, for whatever reasons, whether it was nationalist reasons, or we are a different colony and we're not going to speak that French. It's sort of like the reason why Webster published his dictionary in America as a nationalist thing. We could have perfectly well used Dr. Johnson's dictionary, but we needed something that was original and native, even if it's just repetition. What's interesting, in addition to its divergence from official French, and of course you can find those divergences too when you compare, say, the Spanish in Spain and Spanish in Mexico, depending on the class too. Upper classes in Mexico speak Spanish that's very close to the upper classes in Spain, but the lower classes in Mexico speak Spanish that many people from Spain would not understand. In other words, it diverges more where there is less enforcement. Another interesting point I'm just going to add to the answer, even though it's not your question really, is situations of bilingualism, which can be destabilizing for a nation state. In Quebec, it's been wanting to secede for as long as it exists, probably, and for no other reason than they speak a different language. The same thing in Belgium, right? The Dutch speaking, the Belgians and the French-speaking Belgians hate each other. And they consider each other as two separate cultures. And that has destabilized that country to a large extent. So that, in a way, speaks for linguistic homogeneity as a unifying power in the building of a nation. On the other hand, if you have a country like Switzerland, which has had a decentralized government of cantons, relatively autonomous from one another for a long time, and therefore never seek that total unity that regular nation states have, Switzerland has 4 or 5 different standard languages, official languages. You can see it even in the money. And they don't have any problems falling apart. India has something like 16 different official languages. Official, in addition to all the dialects and so on that they also exist. And that is creating some tensions, but not necessarily secession tensions, as in the case of Quebec, or as in the case of Dutch Belgium. So situations of bilingualism create different political circumstances in different ways by interacting with political institutions. And that's another interesting subject worth thinking about. Which brings me to another subject worth thinking about. How am I going to grade you people? I could grade you just because I like your face. But they are not going to accept that. So I'm going to require you to actually write an essay, a 5 to 10-page essay. I will keep it short, single-spaced, regular-sized font. Give me those like 18-point fonts or something. 5 to 10-page essay on materialities, anything. An urban life. It can be anything. It can be about culture, it can be about music, it can be about language, it can be about economics, it can be about linguistics, it can be about academics, it can be anything that we talk about in class or things that we never talked about in class. It doesn't really matter. What I need to know, and I'm going to use coaches' language right now, is if you can run with a ball. Actually, what I would want you is to beat the ball, but short of that, I want to know if you can run with the ball. What does that mean? You can use the ideas from class and then apply them on a subject matter that you chose. Because that way, you tell me to let me know that you're all set to go, right? You have absorbed ideas from class, now you're using them on your own, and now I can tell, well, this was a productive class, you guys did learn something. Try to pick a subject where you can actually do an explanation for something, just like I've been doing throughout the semester. I don't want a bunch of dates and a bunch of numbers, because a bunch of dates and a bunch of numbers looks like something that you paste and copy from Wikipedia or something. There's so many places you can go right now and just cut and paste stuff. I don't even know how your teachers keep up with you guys. I mean, how are they going to find out that you actually wrote or didn't write that paper, right? You just cut and paste it. It's like so simple. Well, they can Google search it, right?
Well,
Probably put a few words of that thing. Aha, I just thought about that.
There's a whole system called Turnitin.com where it searches.
You're kidding me, to
all
check for
publications
that?
and all, yeah. And it tells like how much
Well, I'm glad you
percentage.
told me because I was to fake a paper tomorrow. I was going to get caught. So, don't make it sound like you took it from a website. And the best way of doing it is if you're picking up something that looks problematic, something that demands an explanation, and you give me an explanation using concepts from the class. Right? Now, they gave me 2 possible deadlines for you. And this, I don't have a say on this. I need to choose one of the 2. One is November 29th, which is the last day of classes. April 29th. Did I say November? Okay, you can wait until November 29th. Take your time. Relax. Or May the 5th. You can choose right now. As far as I'm concerned, I can give you all the way till May the 5th. You're going to be mailing it to me. I'm emailing it to me.
Yeah, what's that?
All the way to New York and deliver it in person. You're going to email it to me to the following email address. Don't get too spooked about this, okay? It doesn't really mean anything. I don't believe in the Antichrist. And anything, I would be the anti-Antichrist. At pipeline.com. I'm going to be repeating this for the rest of the week because this is very important, of course. And it needs to be in PDF format. I have horrible problems opening files in it, even doc files, written Word format. That's supposed to be the lingua franca. Well, Microsoft is not exactly a reliable vendor. I cannot open files with Microsoft. Microsoft cannot open any other file with my Mac. PDF is a true international standard, right? So let's use that standard. So start checking whether your word processor can export files in PDF before you go through your studios. Remember what happened to you people as your studio deadlines approach. It's downright creepy. Okay, you don't sleep for 72 hours, 96 hours. I see you on the halls walking around like living dead. You know, it's like scary. know, just go ahead, don't bite me. Just like go ahead and do whatever it is that you want to do. And remember what George Romero said, zombies don't write good papers. Okay, George Romero didn't say that, but he could have said it. Okay, so before you go into your zombie transition and become that other person that no one likes, pick a subject for your paper. You can write to me at that email address once the class is over. And I say next week, starting next week. Ask me, is this a good subject? Do you have any text to recommend? And so on and so forth. And start picking your subject now. Just start triangulating the search space. Start trying triads of words in your Google window, and use always, by the way, Google Scholar when you do your searches. Google Scholar finds all the different versions of the same essay in the web. Because sometimes some essays, they want to charge you like $30 for a single essay. That to me is a personal insult. If they were telling you, well, you're going to pay $1 for an essay, hey, I would pay $1 to help that author survive. But $30 for an essay that probably sucks, forget about it. So use Google Scholar that finds, say, all 13 versions of the same essay at once. And that way, if it's available free in PDF, you will find it there. So start triangulating the search space with triads of words to see which three words triangulate the space better. Find those essays. You don't have to read them right now. Start downloading them. And try to see whether you can get interested in one particular historical problem. You don't have to stick to the areas that we studied here. You can do cities in Asia, cities in Latin America, cities in India, cities in Africa, any place. In fact, it would be better if you chose a city that we did not discuss in class. Because again, that will show me that you can run with the ball, that you can apply the ideas to an original example. I'm going to be repeating this every day, but nobody misses the point that I have to give you a grade. And I cannot give you a grade unless you give me your essay. Okay? So let's say that May 5th is the deadline. Would that be better for you guys?
No.
Instead of April 29?
No.
It's better April 29?
April 29.
Okay, let me see some hands. April 29.
Zombie state, guys.
Yeah, but it'll just...
Don't be
if you can
shy.
finish it
Okay,
by
May
29.
5th. Okay, the May 5th happens.
Just finish it
Sorry,
by
April
29.
29ers.
Pretend that you're...
I don't remember that.
I know, neither do I.
I mean, I was giving you that choice because after April 29, you go into your final exam. Weeks, right? And now you're going to be like super busy. So I thought, let's get this out of the way before you go into that. But if you need an extra week, hey, May 5th at 12 midnight, say. I need an email in my inbox in PDF format with really smart things written on it. Well, if you're Cinderella, you do have to worry about that because those 3 hours you can become a pumpkin, before you get home. But for most other purposes, it doesn't really matter. Okay, guys, I will see you Thursday.